Okay, well, good afternoon. Welcome to the latest installment of our Technology and Society Forum series. For those who don't know me, I'm Maury Cohen. Among other things, I'm the director of the Science, Technology, and Society program, and one of the co-organizers and facilitators of this forum. Let me start off by, first of all, thanking Paul Dine, the Honors College, for their support, both for this event specifically as well as the series overall, which plays out over the course of the entire semester. And also special thanks to Jay Caprath from the math department, who is really the impresario who pulls these events together. So Jay, thank you very much. I am delighted today to introduce Michael Klare. Dr. Klare is the Five Colleges Professor of Peace and World Security Studies, a position that spans 5 institutions: Amherst College, Hampshire College, Mount Holyoke College, Smith College, as well as the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He's also the director of the Five College Program in Peace and World Security Studies. He's the author of, by my count, which may be off by 1 or 2, 14 books, including his most recent one entitled The Race for What's Left: The Global Scramble for the World's Last Resources. Some of you may know him as the defense correspondent for The Nation magazine. He writes regularly for a number of familiar publications, including Foreign Affairs, Scientific American, and MIT's Technology Review. It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Klare to NJIT. He's going to be speaking today, as indicated on the screen behind me. Sort of. No, that's the wrong slide. In any event, the title of his talk today is Global Assault: The Scramble for the World's Last Resources. So nice round of applause for Professor Klare. Plan today is he's going to speak for about 35 minutes, and then we're going to have a wide open discussion. He's promised he'll answer any questions you want to throw at him. So, Michael, please.
Thank you. So hello, everybody, and thank you very much for coming out. I'm actually very happy to be here because I'm looking forward to your response to what I have to say. And so listen carefully and be prepared to challenge me on anything I say. The part that'll be most interesting, I think, for all of us is when you challenge my points and I get to hear your views and we have a discussion about this. So the essence of the argument that I want to make today is that we're facing an inevitable transition from one economic industrial system to another, from a system based on non-renewable materials to a system based on renewable materials. This transition, as I say, is inevitable, and I'll say why I think that's true, and you could challenge me about that. But the timing of the transition remains undetermined. It could happen sooner or later. Oh, okay. The transition can happen sooner or later, depending on our actions, human actions. But it will almost certainly occur during the lifetime of the students in this room, in the next 50 years or so. But it could happen much sooner than that or much later. And I want to emphasize today, that's my argument, that there are enormous benefits from making the transition sooner rather than later, and severe penalties for delaying the transition, which is the course we're presently on. So that's what I want to try to argue. So first, let me say why I think a transition is inevitable. And I'm going to speak mainly about energy materials, because that's what I know best, and that's what's so most crucial to the functioning of a modern industrial society. But what I have to say is also true of all the basic minerals upon which our civilization rests. Basically, everything that you do on this campus, I mean, all the buildings and all of that, energy materials all of this, I'm going to talk about energy, but the same argument applies to all of them. So let's start with the basics. Non-renewable materials are by definition non-renewable. They're finite. They are going to disappear sooner or later. We're using them up, and once they're gone, they can't be replaced, or at least not in a useful lifetime. It took oil, natural gas, tens or hundreds of millions of years to form, and it's conceivable that will happen again, but the supply that we currently have will disappear. We've used up so far about 3/5 of the world's conventional petroleum. That's about 1.2 trillion barrels of oil out of somewhere approximately 2 trillion barrels of oil, and about half of the world's conventional natural gas. And at current rates of consumption, all things being equal, the rest will disappear in the next 50 years. Now, before I go further, let me make clear that I recognize that these materials are not going to disappear in an ultimate sense. There'll always be some hidden pockets of oil and gas and everything else that we cannot exploit today using existing technology and may be exploitable in the future. But what we are facing today is the disappearance of easy oil. That's an industry term. We're facing the disappearance of easy oil, easy natural gas, easy copper, easy uranium, easy everything else. And instead, we're becoming increasingly dependent on tough sources of supply, tough gas, tough oil, and so on. So to distinguish these two, because you'll ask me about this, easy gas and easy oil come from reserves that are relatively close to the surface, relatively close to shore, not too far north of the Arctic Circle. They're easy to extract from the earth, and most importantly, they're very easily converted into a useful substance like gasoline or diesel fuel or burnable natural gas. That's easy oil. Tough oil, by comparison, tough gas lies deep underground, far offshore, hundreds of miles offshore, and then deep beneath the surface of the seabed, or are located in remote and difficult locations like the Arctic and Siberia, or they're trapped in impermeable rock like shale that cannot be exploited using normal means. So these tough reserves, also called unconventional oil and gas, include Canadian tar sands, shale oil and shale gas, Venezuelan extra heavy crude, other Arctic oil, and so on. Now, let me be quite clear that I acknowledge that these materials exist in great abundance. There's something like 1 trillion barrels of tar sands conceivably could be converted into oil if we want to go down that path, and 1 trillion barrels of Venezuelan extra heavy crude. So they exist, but extracting them and exploiting them is going to be very difficult. Some of the reserves are located, as I say, in harsh rock conditions and shale, and they can only be exploited using extreme methods of extraction, basically smashing the rock, fracturing the rock, shattering the rock with water, what we call fracturing. So the cost of production is going to increase. Now, this brings us to a question of the role of technology. This is the School of Technology, and what role it will play in the future. Many experts in the field, like Daniel Yergin, if you're familiar with that name, the author of the book The Prize, a new book called The Quest, writes that unconventional reserves, unconventional supplies of energy, are simply conventional supplies that will become, or they're materials that will become conventional in time with the application of advanced technology. Shale gas, he says, is now unconventional, but in time will be considered conventional. So there is this argument, and I want to admit there's some truth in this. We now can extract oil and gas from under 2 miles of water, something that 10 years ago nobody would have thought was possible. So we can do extraordinary things. However, we're also discovering that we're coming to some very real limits to what technology can accomplish. And I'm sure you're going to want to discuss this with me afterwards. But bear in mind, we're now coming to the planet's very last frontiers. Because all the easy stuff, everything easily accessible, all the oil and gas that can be easily extracted from the United States and Mexico and the Middle East and Russia and Canada, it's largely gone. So if you're going to replace those materials with new sources of energy, you're going to have to go somewhere else, to the extremes, to the far north, to Siberia, to the deep oceans, and so on. And we are reaching the outer limits of what can be accomplished. For example, while it's possible to drill in 1 or 2 miles of ocean, the conditions at the bottom of the well, the pressure is so vast that it requires highly specialized technology, and if one little thing goes wrong, you could have a catastrophic blowout, which is what is the case with the Deepwater Horizon disaster of 2 or 3 years ago. It also costs 10 to 20 or more times as much to produce that oil and gas from these extremes than it does to drill in, say, Saudi Arabia, Iran, or Iraq. And the price cost will continue to rise indefinitely in the future as we drill deeper underground or further in more remote areas. And at some point, the costs of production exceed the profits that you might make on drilling these operations, making them unsustainable. And we see evidence that this is happening with, for example, Shell Oil's attempt to drill in the Arctic Ocean off of Alaska. They've spent $4.5 billion so far in attempting to make this work. And last summer, when they really got underway for the first time, they ran into constant obstacles from sea ice, from extreme storms. Their ships were shipwrecked, and they're going to have to start all over again, or they're thinking about whether they're going to start all over again, but they're finding it so difficult to do this. So you reach very extreme geological and environmental conditions when you go to these resource frontiers. Aside from the difficulty of extraction, which is becoming more and more expensive, you also have to realize we're dealing with degraded, substandard materials that require a lot of upgrading to be useful. If you're, for example, if we're looking at Canadian tar sands, now people in their advertising, if you watch cable TV, you're going to see a lot of advertising about the attraction of Canada's oil or Canada's oil sands. Let me explain. There is no oil in Canada. What you have is muck, a tar-like muck, which is made up of a degraded form of petroleum, bitumen, plus sand and clay and other impurities. The bitumen has lost a lot of its light hydrocarbons, light hydrogen, so it's much denser material. It's closer to coal than it is to conventional petroleum. And processing that into something usable is exceedingly expensive and environmentally hazardous. You have to use a lot of water to make this work. 3 barrels of water for each barrel of tar sands oil when you're done. So the cost and the environmental risk of using these unconventional second-class materials is going to make them less and less attractive as time goes on. And they also require a lot of energy to do this. It takes about 2 barrels of energy in, usually natural gas, to heat up the steam to melt the bitumen for the 3 barrels of oil coming out. And eventually the ratio of energy in to energy out will grow so high that it becomes unprofitable to produce them. So we're dealing with the frontiers of production and with degraded second-class materials, and in time it's simply going to become more attractive to go somewhere else. And I can talk more about other ways in which that's so. But another aspect of all this that's not taken into the equations by people like Daniel Yergin and others is not just the higher cost of production, but also the fact that no matter what they say, this is not conventional means of production. This is unconventional means of production. It involves a lot of environmental hazard, the use of a lot of water, and the water becomes contaminated, and it cannot be allowed into the drinking supply because it's toxic and carcinogenic. So resistance to the use of these materials is growing. And we see this with opposition to fracking or opposition to tar sands in Canada. The point is that there is a public or a social dimension to the production of these exotic materials, degraded materials, that has to be added into the equation. And the fact is, all of them involve release more carbon dioxide than the production of conventional fuels. So the rate of global warming is going to increase. And as global warming becomes more intense and the destructive power of climate change becomes more apparent, like with Hurricane Sandy, opposition to burning carbon dioxide is going to grow. So for all of these reasons, I argue that a shift, a transition from these non-renewable fuels to renewable green technology is inevitable. It is going to occur. As the planet gets hotter and the cost of producing them rises to an unprofitable level, people will make a change. So we can be sure in time that this will occur. But as I say, the timing is the part that we don't know about. And I want to argue, and this is the essence of what I want to say, is that there are profound advantages for beginning this transition sooner rather than later. And here again, I look forward to your reactions to what I have to say. But let me start with the benefits to making an early transition away from the fossil fuels and other non-renewable sources of supply. The longer we continue to burn fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, the more carbon we're going to pump into the atmosphere. That's a simple mathematical equation. We keep increasing the consumption of fossil fuels every year, and we're expected to do so for as long into the future as anybody wants to calculate. But the latest projections from the U.S. Department of Energy are through 2040, when fossil fuels continue to supply 80% of our energy, all things being equal. That's in 2040. That's about 50% more than we consume today. So there will be approximately, more or less, 50% more carbon dioxide being released every year into the atmosphere. Now, if we continue at that rate and don't alter our behavior, we're likely to see a minimum increase in the world's average temperatures of 4 degrees centigrade. We've experienced up till now something like 0.5 degree centigrade in average warming. So imagine 8 times that amount of increase. That's what is likely to occur if we go on business as usual. And the consequences of this are catastrophic. For example, if we go beyond 2 degrees centigrade increase in temperature, it's likely we'll see 5 to 10 feet or more increase in sea level. And that's not a level that the planet can tolerate with impunity. If we see 10 or 15, 5 or 10, 15 feet increase in average sea levels, cities like Newark, where we are today, and New York City, large parts of them, Boston, Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Miami, will become essentially uninhabitable or non-functionable if we go to that level of temperature. Similarly, if we get that high in average world temperature, we're going to see droughts unlike anything we've seen ever before, profound, prolonged, worldwide droughts that will, in the end, cripple the world's food supply. So eating will be put to risk as a result. So this is if we continue without altering our behavior through 2040, without changing essentially the source of our energy. Now, we can probably survive 2 degrees centigrade increase in world temperature, but not 4 degrees. So by delaying the transition, we risk great catastrophe. But if we make the transition now, we have a chance of averting the most catastrophic consequences of climate change. We could keep sea level from rising that high, and we can ensure there's enough food to feed the world population. Second advantage in moving faster to the transition is the cost, the ultimate cost of this transition. This is so because the longer we wait, not only will the planetary damage be much, much greater, exponentially greater, and so the work of overcoming that. You can respond to a 1 or 2 feet increase in average sea levels and, building dikes and walls and other remedial features around our coastal cities. But 10 or 15 feet or more, the cost of that would be, would take up our entire GDP to do that, or something of that magnitude. So if you're going to wait until the conditions are much more fierce and catastrophic, the cost of the transition goes up proportionally speaking. And the time, the speed with which we're going to have to act will increase. If we wait till 2040 to make these changes, which we're going to have to anyway, if we wait that long, then we're going to need to do all of this in a hurry to prevent absolutely catastrophic effects. And the cost of doing so will be much greater than if we start now. So the advantage of early transition is to deeply reduce the cost that will inevitably have to be paid. And there are also economic benefits and political benefits for those corporations, cities, and countries which make the transition sooner rather than later. Now, I say this because I believe, and I try to argue, that a transition away from non-renewable materials and fossil fuels is inevitable. We will have to do this in the next 50 years or so. It's got to have to happen. And it's going to require the development and installation of whole new technologies, new materials, all the kind of work that many of you folks must be doing here. And there will be a big advantage for those who start early in this process, even though there'll be a little bit of a high expense just in being the first to go, taking these risks. But if you move faster, you'll have those technologies available when the transition has to occur. But more important than that, you're going to have the factories and the companies and the employment and the economic and political benefits of being prepared to handle this magnitude of transition. And those people who wait are going to have to rely on those who went first. Will have to buy their technology We'll lose the economic benefits and become dependent on those others, the ones who went first. So there are enormous advantages for making this transition sooner. What about the advantages and disadvantages of delaying? That's certainly worth talking about. Comparison. There is an advantage in delaying. Transitioning our economy and our industrial system to whole new sources of energy, new materials, is going to be expensive and difficult. There's no question about it. So there's a certain temptation to say, well, let's go about our business the way things are now, not deal with all that disruption, let other people take the risks of getting started, and we could catch up once the kinks have been worked out of all these systems and the new technologies are available. So that would be the advantage of waiting. But there's a downside to this, as I've already suggested. If you wait, then you're going to turn over to those early starters all of the economic advantages of going first. And you'll lose the jobs that go with that and everything else. There are also likely to be political advantages in going first and disadvantages for waiting. And I say this because as a student of world economic history, which we should all know, it's very clear that the United States became the great power that it is today, militarily and economic and otherwise, because it was the first country to pioneer the production and use of oil. Oil is what made the United States great. It was our first multinational industry, the first giant corporation, Standard Oil Company, including Standard Oil of New Jersey and New York, now ExxonMobil, and also the leading drive for the internal combustion engine, the automobilization, the suburbanization of America. All of that was made possible because the United States went first in developing oil, and all the other countries fell behind in the global political contest. What happens if we wait and allow other countries to take the lead in the development of the next generation of technologies? Let's say, for example, that China's leaders decide that in order to stay in power, now I'm talking about the Communist Party leadership of China, for them to stay in power much longer, it seems pretty evident that they're going to have to replace the country's existing economic paradigm, which is based on rapid growth powered by coal. They consume more coal than anybody else in the world and produce more carbon dioxide emissions. And if you've read the papers lately, you can't see 5 feet in front of you in some northern Chinese cities because of the density of pollution from coal production. And it's becoming increasingly clear that this is what is arousing more opposition to the leadership in China than anything else. There have been huge demonstrations, not always reported, of environmentalists and others against the pollution and the environmental degradation in China. So let's say China's leaders decide we have to make the conversion to renewables and green energy in order to save our own skin, to keep our party in power indefinitely. And let's say they succeed in mastering the new technologies. And let me tell you, they're already thinking along these lines, spending billions and billions, tens of billions of dollars in the next 5-year plan to speed up the development of advanced energy sources, green technology, solar, wind, and everything else. Let's say we don't do that in this country. We let China take the lead. What happens 20, 30, 40 years from now when China is the world master of the new technology which we all must rely on in order to survive global warming and everything else that goes with it? I think that the political consequences of that would be disastrous. It would make the United States go from a dominant world power to a subordinate, second-class world power and allow China to dominate the world scene. This is what I think will occur if history tells us anything. And as an American, I'm not very happy about that prospect. So there are political advantages for going quickly and severe political disadvantages, I believe, waiting. despite what seems the easy way out. So, to conclude this discussion, and I know you're going to challenge me about this, but I do believe that going sooner to make a transition rather than waiting will have enormous advantages for this country, and enormous disadvantages and penalties will be paid if we fail to do so, if we delay. And other countries will reap the benefits of that inevitable transition. So what does that mean for us in this country if we want to alter the picture and move from a later transition to a sooner transition? What do we have to do? It seems to me that we have to create policymakers, corporate policymakers, politicians, other people in power, that making this transition will be to their benefit, their personal benefit, as well as to the benefit of everyone in the country. And there are all kinds of good reasons why we want to make that transition on moral grounds, on environmental grounds, on ethical grounds. But I think the argument that has to be made is that to preserve our prosperity and our status and our well-being, we have to make this change sooner rather than later. If we can convince leaders of this necessity, or let me just say, before I go further with this, that there will be opposition. There will be powerful opposition. Because if you agree with even a small percentage of what I say, you see that we have to move swiftly away from oil and other fossil fuels. But the giant oil companies have no interest whatsoever in making that transition. Their profits, their power, their wealth comes from preserving their business model by keeping us addicted to oil and other fossil fuels forever. That is their plan. No end to the age of oil. It goes on indefinitely. And they're not making plans or investing money in a transition. More than that, they're using their power to try to persuade us that that climate change is a myth, and that the threat is tolerable, and we don't have to make any changes. So there will be enormous resistance to making this change. And I think this is going to become the dominant issue in American politics in the decades ahead, between those who wish to preserve at all costs our current economic paradigm based on oil and non-renewable materials, and those who see the necessity of moving away. But what if we do make that decision? What will this require? It will require ceasing all tax breaks and subsidies and other benefits that we as taxpayers give to the fossil fuel industry for continuing their production of oil and gas and so on, and give all that money and more to be invested in research and development on alternative energy systems and alternative materials and technologies. That we'll have to do. We'll have to place increasingly strict restrictions on the emissions of carbon dioxide and greater requirements for reliance on renewable energy in the generation of electricity, what are called renewable energy portfolio standards. Now, this may seem like a very difficult path to follow, but California has already moved in this direction by requiring high renewable energy standards and imposing strict curbs on what refineries and utilities, what kind of emissions they can put into the atmosphere. So this is doable. And eventually, we're going to want more substantial measures like a carbon tax or a cap-and-trade system, devices that would provide incentives for corporations, governments, individuals to switch, to move from their reliance on fossil fuels to reliance on renewable green technology. So My last words before you get a chance is this. I want you to think about your future, your career futures, about your family future, and about the future of our society as a whole. What's in our best interests for all of us? And I believe that means moving very swiftly to undertake a transition to a new energy, new materials paradigm, and to reject the notion of delay. And I think that's in the best interest of all of us. So I will stop there. I've made a lot of points that I hope that you'll find most of them persuasive, but I'm very happy to entertain any questions that you have about anything I said or anything about energy, or raw materials, extraction, or anything connected with that. So, thank you for listening.
I think we've got somebody here who's going to run microphones. Yeah, okay. So if you could just wait until a microphone arrives in your hand, and then make sure it's on, and then speak into the microphone so we can pick it up for the recording.
I mean, there's a lot of problems, for example.
All of them.
Well, for example, like solar,
Yeah.
you have to mine rare earth metals to get them, and then if we switch over to a system like that, we just have to worry about, oh, we don't have those rare earth metals anymore. We'll have the problem again.
Well, in my new book, The Race for What's Left, I talk about the problem with rare earths. So I'm very familiar with that problem. I think that's a reasonable question. But Japan, which is another one of the countries that understands the logic of what I'm saying, is investing huge amounts of money to develop alternatives for rare earths that are not as difficult to procure. So I think those kind of roadblocks can be eliminated with an adequate program of research and development. But the Japanese are moving very swiftly. Japan is the biggest consumer of rare earths. Toyota is the single biggest user because the Prius and other hybrid vehicles use more rare earths than anything else. And so Toyota and other Japanese manufacturers are putting a lot of money into finding substitutes that do not create these problems. Now, the problem with wind and solar, the biggest problem is storage, because they can provide a lot of energy when it's sunny, when it's windy, during daytime, but not so much at night or when it's still, the air is still. But they produce enough during the daytime to have a surplus, which we now cannot easily store. So the frontier of research is in energy storage, and breakthroughs are now being made in how to do that. For example, a new solar plant is opening up in Arizona, Mammoth solar plant, which uses molten salt. And so you heat up the salt, liquid salt, during the daytime, and it retains enough heat at night that the plant operates 24/7. So this is the difficulty, but it's being worked on. Oh, should I call people? I saw your hand and then here. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know there were two, so you'll be next, please.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
One is, you said sooner versus later, but I think the critical question is, what does sooner mean? And so if this dysfunctional government we have decided tomorrow that we would have a veritable Marshall Plan for renewables, when do you think, I mean, after all, it's only a few percent currently in terms of our energy production. When do you think, at the earliest, that we could get to the point where we could say that we have enough viable renewables so you could get rid of fossil fuels? So that's one question.
I might not be able to, I mean, that's going to be a tough one to answer, but tell me the other and I'll see if I could do both.
Yeah, but it's absolutely critical.
Oh, yeah,
that-
absolutely.
that
I'm
we
happy
figure
to
out
discuss that.
When in the best case scenario,
Yeah.
we might be able to achieve what you're talking about.
Right.
And the second question is, do you worry that your argument is now being undercut by what appears to be the ascendancy of natural gas with fracking? I mean, as you know, almost every week or two, you read of a new source of shale natural gas, the latest, a huge potential amount from Argentina. Now, if we have a glut of natural gas with fracking, then how in the world are you going to get the people who make decisions to move away from natural gas and other fossil fuels toward the renewables that you espouse?
These are essential questions that everybody in America and the world needs to work on. So if you work back from what it takes, from what the International Energy Agency says we have to do to avert going beyond 2 centigrade degrees increase in world temperatures, we are going to have to make a massive, fast effort. And I'm very worried that that will be exceedingly difficult. But that is in the next 25 years, soon. So that is the time frame, and the IEA, International Energy Agency, which you could all look up online, has a blueprint for getting there. And it's a combination of increased wind power, solar, it's wedges, that this is possible. They favor nuclear power, which is something that nobody has raised yet, but I expect will come up into the discussion. Much more wind and solar, but it also involves, the question here is going to be not just satisfying demand, but eliminating demand. So if you try to meet the IEA's expected increase in energy demand for the world, which is 55%, 56% between now and 2035, that's worldwide, increase in all forms of energy. If you try to do that, I frankly don't see how it's possible. However, I do see that we don't have to raise that high. We don't have to have a 56% increase in world energy use. So the strategy is less about where we're going to get more solar and wind, and it has to be more about how do we reduce our energy consumption through efficiency, through curbs on various uses, and other incentives to move away from heavy consumption. That, I think, is possible. For example, the automobile fuel efficiency standards. We're going to double them in the next 10 or so years, but we can triple them, quadruple them, if we really put our mind to it. And that would eliminate a lot of that added demand. But to really do justice to your question, and I know other people want to speak, the real hard nut to crack is going to be China, which is why I emphasize China. Because something like 50% or more of all the increased demand for energy is expected to come from China. 3/4 of the increased energy demand is going to come from developing Asia, which is India, China, Southeast Asia, South Korea. 3/4 or more, 80% of the addition to the world's energy demand is going to have to come from those places. So China is the linchpin in this, and China has got to take steps to alter its behavior. And I think that's going to happen because the Communist Party is going to wake up, if they haven't already, and decide that their survival of their party and their head is going to require drastic changes in their energy consumption. Now, I don't think I did justice to your question, but at least I hope I started it, and I'll come back. And then.
As someone who already kind of accepts that we need to switch over to a different source of energy as well as renewable technologies, What would you say to the concept that necessity breeds ingenuity? So,
Breeds what?
Necessity breeds ingenuity.
Ingenuity.
So all the problems that we are facing from things like climate change and lowering access to minerals can inevitably be solved by just that need making people want to develop solutions.
Well, there's no question that ingenuity is going to be essential. The problem is that the current distribution, the allocation of money for investment in new products, in new technologies, is going overwhelmingly in the direction of fossil fuels. So according to the IEA, the ratio of new investment in fossil fuels to renewables is 3-to-1. And so unbelievable ingenuity is being put to work in getting oil out of Alaska and out of the deep oceans. That's where the money is going. So ingenuity unleashed. What we have to do is change the priorities of investment, the incentives, so that it's 3-to-1 the other way around, or zero investment in new fossil fuels, and all of that investment money going into alternative technologies. And if we did that, I have no doubt that the obstacles that you raised about solar and wind can be overcome. It's just the money isn't going there. I'll come back to this gentleman. He asked me about shale gas, and I didn't answer that. I have to answer that, but let somebody else speak. In the middle, can somebody? And then I'll go to this side.
Hi. I have long personally had an interest in wind energy.
Wind energy.
On the whole topic of renewables, though, right now the economics are such that, well, wind energy can, in utility scale, just about equal fossil fuels. But that's not really the mode. And so we hear from fossil fuel extractors, producers, that, hey, renewables can only survive based on subsidies. And I am loath to play around with signals from the market, but when they preach like that, they have to remember, but they seem not to, that they are heavily tax subsidized. And what I'm boiling this down to is that I would just love to have a bibliography, a credible one, that gets into the extent to which they are subsidized.
Yes.
Because they always raise hell about renewables
Yeah.
having these tax things
Yeah.
built in, but they have long been the beneficiaries
Yes.
of things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an
So
important
if
task.
you could share with us something like that, I would love it.
Yeah,
if
that
there's-
is a project that I intend to pursue, but I don't have the answer to that now. There is data available, though, on that. President Obama brags in his speeches that fracking was developed at government expense, for example, and horizontal drilling, so that the shale gas revolution was government financed. I think the answer to your point is less for the government to make choices on specific projects than to require standards, certain standards that must be met, renewable energy portfolio standards or reductions on total emissions, and then allow the marketplace to decide which answers, which specific technologies are better. That's the approach they're trying in California. They're saying statewide you can only emit so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and so on, but we leave to you what technologies you're going to employ. And if you go over the limit, you're going to have to buy credits from somebody else, and that will create the incentives to go and make those investments. So that's
But I would say that that top-down command and control model, which I hear an awful lot of, I would rather that, let's say they increase excise taxes on fuels. Now, that's very politically unpopular. If you ever ran on that, you'd probably get kicked out of the room and you wouldn't
Yeah.
get that many votes. But whenever, in the late 70s, when we had one of the first oil crunches, we had a real decline when oil prices got very, very high. We had a real decline in usage. And earlier in this decade, when they got up to $4 a gallon, there was that same effect. Now, that $4 a gallon in 2003, 4, whatever it was like the functional equivalent of $1.50 a gallon back in, say, 1979. And so there is a pain point when people's behavior is changed. And I think that we in this country are sort of like children. I mean, we just don't accept that kind of thing, and we'd rather have command and control rather than just
Yeah.
setting the price higher, which will, I believe, cure a lot of the problem.
You know, like I say, a lot of the changes that are going to occur are going to be inevitable, and that will force people, whatever their politics, to change. There is plenty of tar sands oil and shale, but the cost of producing it is going to continue to rise, and the corporation's going to have to pass that on to consumers. So that's going to start making wind and solar start looking much more attractive just on that basis. But let me take some other questions, and I could come. I promise this gentleman there, and then I'll get you back there, okay?
Hi. I guess one of my main things I kind of wonder about and ponder about is that I was just online. I was just kind of Googling, say like quarter income revenues from these major oil corporations. And
Hold your microphone close.
I was kind of just considering I was online. I was kind of curious to see how much these companies make every quarter, and it's something to the tune of like over $10 billion every 3 months. And I guess, you know, in Congress, you kind of know like these companies have a lot of power as far as lobbying and influencing specific candidates and what kind of laws are passed. So how do you compete when you have new renewable technologies where there's no viable competitors to compete against a company that's making that much money? And the influence they have in Congress, because ultimately we need the leaders to make the decisions to switch over and to allocate money for research and development of newer technologies.
I understand exactly what you're asking, and as I say, their profits are going to start declining, and all of what we're talking. To make sense out of this, you have to accept my argument about inevitability, and inevitably, green technology is going to overtake fossil fuels because it has innate advantages. Now, the oil companies are going to try to prevent that from happening as long as possible. However, what's going to happen in the meantime is that new centers of power are going to arise. New economic centers of power will arise that are based on delivering green technology. And as their income rises, their political clout will begin to compete with that of the oil companies. And an example of this is in California, where the Koch brothers, who derive most of their income from refining and the production of dirty oil, they tried to finance with all their advertising the repeal of the proposition that is now in place to require these tough fuel standards and curbs on carbon emissions in California. So they tried to terrorize people into voting to prevent that from coming into force. If anybody from California, it's either Proposition 23 or 32. It's one or the other. What is it? Oh, well, what happened is that people from Silicon Valley who are very heavily invested in renewable sources of energy, alternative sources of energy, because they use up so much electricity for their computers, they put more money or as much money into the race with the producers of solar panels and so on that they were able to prevent the Koch brothers from buying that election. So the answer is that's the way it's going to have to happen. a switch in economic power away from the oil companies. And the oil companies in time will lose their power because they make $10 billion a year, but each day more of their profits are going into preserving their net level of reserves, because we're seeing the elimination, as I said, of all the easy oil. It's disappearing very rapidly. And the new oil, whether it's shale oil or anything else, is more costly and more difficult to produce. So they have to spend more and more of their money to keep even. And eventually, that process will become unsustainable. Yes, back there, please.
So, if banking off what he said, how, well, to start, the renewable sources, they kind of threaten our way of life because of the lack of efficiency. I mean, they're still very efficient, but, you know, oil and stuff like that really, it's more efficient, if you will. So, if politicians, like people that run for president, people aren't going to want to vote for them because of the threat to our very way of life. So what's another way that we can kind of, since politicians are the one that like make the choices to switch over to renewable sources, what's another way we can do it, or what's another way that they can like sell themselves so that people will actually vote for them and we can actually get a change?
Yeah. Okay. But my answer to that, I think I explained in my comments that the production of fossil fuels, we're really in a new era. And I claim that the materials we're talking about today, shale oil, shale gas, tar sands, they're not conventional fuels. They're new substances altogether. And to produce them is going to require severe invasion of this country. Now, bear in mind, most oil in the past came from what we used to call the third world. We got it from Mexico, from Saudi Arabia, from Nigeria, from Venezuela, and the pollution and environmental devastation that brought with it was confined there. Not entirely, but for the most part. Now, with these new technologies, the target of this invasive technology is New Jersey and Pennsylvania, not so much New Jersey. However, the Marcellus Formation does extend into New Jersey. And certainly, most of the other states of the United States are going to be treated like what we used to call third world countries, which is you trash them and you screw them over. That's what's happening in Pennsylvania, in North Dakota, and Louisiana, and Alaska. They're being trashed. And as a consequence of that, people are going to rise up in rebellion, and that is exactly what's happening. So the notion that people are going to be indifferent in these races is not going to turn out that way. I think more and more Americans are going to say, I'd rather have clean solar energy than this highly destructive tar sands that's polluting my backyard. We'll have to see, but that's my response to that. One and then two. The blue shirt down. Oh, okay. You go first, and then I'll get you. Yeah.
Okay. So I have a couple of potential points. So one, you mentioned it before, but nuclear fusion is a topic that you haven't really broached, and due to the recent successes that I think the IEA has had with actually producing more energy than they've put in for the first time, I want to hear your opinion on that. And also, do you know of, as we said before, that because energy storage is actually the more critical problem with renewable energy, what potential battery solutions there are besides the mass scale ones? Because I really think it's a lot easier to have some sort of storage, like you mentioned before, with factories to have molten salt pits, but on an individual basis, it's a lot more difficult. And as a final note, I think a point that we also failed to mention is infrastructure. We're all really dependent on fossil fuel burning cars and things like that. So how are we going to manage to change that? Whatever technologies we come up with have to incorporate the existing infrastructure for a certain period of time up until we change that. One of my quote-unquote hypotheses is that if we improve some sort of battery technology up to a point where electric cars, in a sense, becomes very usable and viable, then we'll be able to incorporate that into existing cars, things like
Yeah.
that. Thank you.
Everything you said comes back to the same point, which is the speed of transition, because these transitions are going to occur. They're underway. And you have different competing responses. And in the end, people, I think, are going to go where success lies. So right now, there are some advantages. In this country, we have highways, so cars are very attractive. In China, in Japan, in Europe, and elsewhere, they're building railroads. They're not building highways, which means that as the cost and risk of fossil fuels grow, they'll be better positioned. Their economies will be stronger than ours, and we will see the need to do those things that we are not now. So really, the question comes back to what I've been saying. How do you accelerate the transition? And I think it has to be showing the long-term economic benefits to all of us of making those changes, of using, I pushed a button by accident here, by showing the economic benefits of these new technologies. And the point that I make is, go to China and see what they're doing with their high-speed rail, or what Germany is doing with wind and solar. And you could see what the future looks like. And I think more and more people will begin to realize that driving a car, which is increasing pollution and creating all kinds of other economic problems, going to be more expensive on roads that can't be maintained, is a losing proposition over time. I just have to make these cost-benefit analyses for people. Yeah. Oh, I had promised this person here with a blue shirt. I can't see.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what makes you think the change isn't already underway? Because you were pretty convinced.
Is underway,
like
or is not?
Like you were saying before, the change hasn't begun yet, like has not begun. But I don't know, I've been reading up, and with the whole car industry moving towards electric cars and all those things, I'm thinking within 10 years, we've kind of already started that whole process. I'm thinking it already has started. So what makes you think we haven't started the right path yet?
That's very fair, but that just requires a clarification. I think the transition is underway, but at different rates of speed in different parts of the country, of the world. Some countries like Germany are moving much more swiftly. Some states like California are moving more swiftly in that direction. Other countries, other states of the US, other jurisdictions are not moving at all. So, but the transition is underway. What I'm saying is, though, that in this country at least, we are pretty much committed to perpetuating oil as the dominant energy for as far as we could see into the future. Other countries are saying, no, we're not going to do that, that fossil fuels will be the dominant form of energy by 2050. Germany says that. I don't know what other countries say that. But that decision has been made in some places, but not here. So yes, you could see signs of transition, but they're marginal, they're peripheral. But certainly electric cars are entirely possible. I mean, they're here. And you just need the right government policies, the rewards, tax breaks for buying an electric car. And there was somebody right behind you. Yes?
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to ask about biofuels, and more specifically bioethanol. In the U.S., I think the major feedstock for bioethanol is corn. And I'm sure there's always incentive, by comparing us to other countries to push for biofuels and other renewable energies. But it's kind of harder because with corn you have, it's the debate between food and feedstock, and it's hard to compromise food when it comes to feeding the people. So how would you address that in terms of pushing towards bioethanol in the U.S.?
Yeah, well, I don't advocate bioethanol based on food crops. So I favor research, a lot of research and investment in non-food crop biofuels, switchgrass and others, corn stalks, what's called cellulosic ethanol from the cellulosic material. Now that technology is another one, like battery storage, that hasn't yet reached commercial scale or profitable scale and needs more investment before it can do that. But I have no doubt that that's an attractive option for the future. Anybody else? Yes, please. I appreciate all your good questions because every one of them is legitimate and worthy of attention, not just from me, but from everyone.
So I have two questions. First is, do you think nuclear energy is an energy source that we should continue to pursue? And second is, how do you think this transition into alternative energy sources would affect emerging markets?
Will affect what?
Emerging markets.
Emerging markets. Oh, all of these questions deserve a half hour, but I know you don't want me to do that. Nuclear power is like other technologies. It goes through constant innovation and adaptation. So most of the nuclear reactors that we have today and are being built use fission, nuclear fission, and have great risks associated with them. They produce toxic radioactive wastes which cannot easily be stored. And I don't think that that's a very viable alternative. But a lot of research is being done on new forms of nuclear energy. Somebody mentioned fusion before. I didn't respond to that. Fusion and new kinds of nuclear reactors that don't produce radioactive waste. So along with other alternatives, I favor investment in these new forms of nuclear energy that don't have the problems of the existing systems. And I don't know what you mean by emerging markets exactly. How do you classify China in that equation? It's hard because China lags behind the West in certain kind of economic and industrial development, but is moving ahead of the West in other ways. And I do believe that China has the potential, as I indicated earlier, of taking leadership in advanced green technology. And I suspect this is going to be the decision of the Politburo to make that a priority. So I think China will move ahead in the development of wind and solar, advanced nuclear, advanced biofuels, and other such technologies. Also India, a generation behind them. I don't know if I'm doing justice to your question. I've enjoyed all of your questions. I'll take more. Yeah? Okay. You haven't asked one, Mark. No, I don't mean to take the floor away from...
I don't mean to take the floor away from anyone else, but I think most of what we've been talking about has more or less been change as driven by from the top down. I'd be curious to get your feedback on the extent to which you see things like the demographic shift in the United States. As the United States American population gets older, people are driving less, they're shifting downshifting into smaller homes, consuming less energy, consuming more health care. Changes like the sizable increase in income inequality that is basically eroding away the sort of central elements of American consumer society and reducing the capacity of Americans to consume at the volumes that we've been accustomed to. Some scholars and analysts have drawn attention to the fact that the United States and perhaps a number of other countries have reached the point of peak car. In other words, the size of the automobile fleet in the United States is now likely to begin to decline, that the number of vehicle miles driven on an annual basis across the country is beginning to decline. I sort of throw this question out to folks who are still in the room with us. How many of you don't have driver's licenses? Well, just one, but that's a bit of an aberration because especially within this age cohort, there's been a very significant drop-off in the number of people who are even reaching that point of getting a driver's license. and entering into the sort of car-driving portion of the American population. So, I mean, some of these things begin to add up into
Yes,
some rather
yes.
sizable
Yeah.
shifts, macro-scale shifts,
Yes.
that independent of what the oil industry or the automobile industry may be driving for, may in fact be reversing course against them.
Yeah, oh, that's so interesting. The response that I would make, the one that I've watched that I think is very decisive is what people call the end of suburbia, the increasing impracticality of a suburban way of life, because so much of the near to city land has already been fully developed. So to perpetuate a suburban way of life, you have to go further away from the center city, drive more miles, spend more money on gasoline, and encounter all kinds of other problems, that it just becomes uneconomic to do that. And in fact, more and more people are choosing to move away from the suburbs, to be closer to cities, closer to the opportunities cities offer, the cultural opportunities, the social opportunities, or they want to be able to live somewhere where you could get a train to go into the city. So the end of and that's where the subprime crisis occurred, was the outer suburbs, for the most part, not the inner suburbs, but the ones with the highest number of driving miles to get there, because those people couldn't afford housing closer anyway. And the only way they could afford a mortgage was to move 50 miles away, where land was cheaper. And those communities, exurbia, are in catastrophic decline in most of the U.S. So we are moving in a more urban, European-style, denser housing, and that way brings down resource consumption for the most part. Cities like, I don't know what your students are like. My students all want to move to Portland, Oregon, because it is a super green city. It has great rapid transit and a very European-like cosmopolitan cafe culture. We all want that. That's where people want to move. And that has profound consumption implications. Anybody who hasn't asked a question? If not, maybe you could be the last question, because that'd be fine. I never answered your question about shale. Let me just take a minute on shale before you asked me about shale. And here's the thing about shale. We don't know yet whether the shale revolution is a bubble or not. It could expand much further, or it might burst. There are a number of reasons to be skeptical, but I say the decision on this still isn't known. Shale is not all alike everywhere. The shale formations differ. I don't know much about the ones in Argentina, but I think there are real problems in Argentina, as there is in China, as there is in Europe, with water. Fracking for shale is an exceedingly water-intensive proposition. Figure 10 million gallons of water per frack, and you have to frack over and over and over again. And many of the places that have the biggest shale reserves, like Patagonia and Xinjiang province of China, have no water. And it's going to have to be trucked there or piped there and taken away from farmers who need it to grow food. So I think that the future is very much in question about how much fracking will occur in those water-scarce areas. We just don't know. The other thing that's less unknown is what is the rate of depletion of shale fields? Because so few of them have been drilled. The oldest that has been intensively drilled is less than 10 years old, the Barnett Field in Texas, coming up on 10 years. And it appears that shale formations deplete exceedingly rapidly, much faster than conventional oil and gas. And that the people get there first and who find out what are called the sweet spots, where you have a high concentration, make the money, and people come afterwards are not making money. That's happened in Montana, and it's happening in other parts of the country. So it's still early. So I remain skeptical that the shale gas revolution is going to spread worldwide, but it might. So we just have to see. Last question.
Hi. I had just a comment about storage of renewably produced energy. I met a man whose business plan was to use wind energy.
Use what?
Wind energy, and with that energy, he was going to hydrolyze water into its component parts, one of which being hydrogen.
Right.
And once created and stored, well, what do we use it for? His idea was a city bus fleet. Well, when he went around to try to do this, well, another thing, everybody would say, oh, hydrogen, you mean fuel cells. No, he found, and it was his opinion, that hydrogen internal combustion engines would be the cheapest, most economic way to go. And whenever he brought this up, they would look at him like he had 3 heads or something. You know, everybody knows that hydrogen is only used with fuel cells, and eventually he just gave up. He couldn't get it done.
Yeah.
And I just thought it was kind of ironic that, you know, sort of a form of closed-mindedness prevented something that made a lot of sense, I thought.
I suspect there are other people who've come up with innovative solutions that are also been shunted aside. But my guess is they'll become more appealing as time goes on. But what you say is interesting. I'll have to investigate that.
Like you say, there's an awful lot going on in renewable energy. I think it's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, yeah, and universities everywhere, here and in the rest of the world. So in time, I think they will triumph. It's just a matter of when. And with that, I think we should finish.
Well, I thank all of you for hanging with us till the bitter end. Michael, thank you very much.
Sure.
Both for your presentation and your patience and perseverance with questions. So thank you very much, and we'll see you all again at our next event.